Rain lashed against the penthouse windows, masking the sound of a fractured marriage. Dominic slammed the heavy oak door, leaving his wife in the freezing storm. He thought it was a lesson in loyalty. Instead, it became the exact moment he handed her directly to his deadliest enemy. The Tribeca penthouse, a $30 million fortress of glass and steel overlooking the Hudson River, felt more like a tomb tonight. Dominic Vitiello, the undisputed head of the Vitiello syndicate, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of Macallan 18 clutched so tightly in his hand that the crystal threatened to shatter. He was a man who ruled New York's underworld with absolute, frigid calculation. Men feared his silence more than his wrath. But tonight, that silence was weaponized against the one person who was supposed to be untouchable. His wife, Madeline. Less than 10 minutes ago, the heavy oak front door had slammed shut with a deafening finality. On the other side of it, locked out in the bitter, sleet-filled November night, was Madeline. The argument had been swift and venomous. Dominic's paranoia, fueled by weeks of intercepted shipments and internal leaks, had reached a boiling point when his underboss, Matteo Bianchi, handed him a burner phone found hidden deep inside Madeline's vanity drawer. The text messages on it were heavily encrypted, but the destination number belonged to the inner circle of Lorenzo Castiglione, the ruthless boss of the rival Castiglione family. Lorenzo was Dominic's greatest threat, a ghost of a man slowly expanding his territory from Brooklyn into Manhattan. When confronted, Madeline hadn't cried. She had stood there in her thin silk evening gown, her copper hair cascading over her shoulders, and stared at him with wide, desperate eyes. "Dominic, it's not what it looks like," she had pleaded, stepping toward him. "You have to trust me. I was trying to stop something terrible. Salvatore is—" "Save your lies for someone stupid enough to believe them," Dominic had interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. He hadn't raised a hand to her. He didn't need to. His eyes, devoid of any warmth, did enough damage. He had gripped her by the arm, marched her to the foyer, and pushed her out into the private elevator lobby. "When you decide who your family actually is, maybe we can talk," he had sneered. "Until then, go find Lorenzo. Let's see how long his hospitality lasts." Now, Dominic took a slow sip of his whiskey. The burn did nothing to thaw the ice in his chest. He expected her to crack. He expected the intercom to buzz, for her to weep and beg for forgiveness, confessing whatever petty financial secrets she had sold to the Castigliones. He glanced at the glowing digital clock on his desk. 11:45 p.m. The temperature outside was hovering just above freezing. She had no coat, no purse, no phone. Just a silk dress and heels. "Boss," Matteo's voice broke the heavy silence. The underboss stepped into the dimly lit study, his posture rigid. "The storm is getting worse. Sleet's turning to ice. You want me to send a car down to the lobby, just to watch her? She doesn't have a jacket." Dominic didn't turn around. "If you send a car, Matteo, you can pack your bags and get in it with her. She made her choice. Let the cold remind her what happens when you step out of the warmth of this family." Matteo hesitated, shifting his weight. "With respect, Dominic, what if she was telling the truth? She mentioned your uncle Salvatore. Salvatore's been making moves behind your back for months." "My uncle is family. Blood," Dominic snapped, finally turning, his dark eyes flashing with lethal intensity. "My wife was secretly communicating with a man who put a bullet in my father 5 years ago. There is no excuse. Let her walk." Down on the street level, the reality of Dominic's cruelty was crashing down on Madeline. The wind howling off the Hudson River cut through her silk gown like razor blades. The cobblestone streets of Tribeca were slick with freezing rain. the glowing street lamps casting long, distorted shadows. She hugged her arms tightly across her chest, her teeth chattering so violently her jaw ached. She didn't know where to go. All her friends were mafia wives, women who would slam their doors in her face the second they realized she had fallen out of Dominic's favor. Calling the police wasn't an option. The NYPD was in Dominic's pocket, and doing so would only validate his accusations of betrayal. She limped down Greenwich Street, her expensive heels completely unsuited for the icy pavement. Tears mixed with the freezing rain on her cheeks, but they weren't tears of self-pity. They were tears of sheer terror. She knew what the encrypted messages meant. She knew what was coming tonight. Salvatore, Dominic's treacherous uncle, had orchestrated a massive hit on Dominic, scheduled to happen at the Brooklyn Navy Yard before dawn. Madeline had accidentally overheard Salvatore's men planning it. Desperate and knowing Dominic wouldn't believe a word against his beloved uncle, she had done the unthinkable. She reached out to Lorenzo Castiglione. Lorenzo hated Dominic, yes. But Lorenzo hated Salvatore more, blaming the old man for a car bombing that killed Lorenzo's sister years ago. Madeline had offered Lorenzo the shipping routes in exchange for him intercepting Salvatore's hit squad. She had traded mafia secrets to save her husband's life, and for her sacrifice her husband had thrown her to the wolves. A sleek black SUV idled at the corner of Canal Street, its tinted windows rolling down just a fraction. Madeline froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dominic's men? Or worse, Salvatore's. The back door clicked open. A deep, raspy voice called out over the pounding rain. "Get in, Madeline, before you freeze to death, or before Salvatore's hunters find you. Your husband is a fool, but I am not." It wasn't Dominic. It was Lorenzo Castiglione. Shivering, terrified, and with no other choice to survive the night, Madeline stepped out of the freezing storm and into the enemy's car. By 2:15 a.m., the silence in the penthouse had transformed from a display of power into a suffocating, unbearable weight. The intercom had never buzzed. The private elevator had remained stationary. Dominic sat at the head of his mahogany dining table, the burner phone dismantled in front of him. Across from him sat Elias, the syndicate's chief cryptographer. The young man's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard, lines of decrypted code reflecting in his wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm through the final encryption layer, boss," Elias said, his voice unusually quiet. He swallowed hard, refusing to look Dominic in the eye. "The messages, they're fully translated." "Print them," Dominic commanded, his voice dead flat. "Dominic, you need to read this from the screen," Elias insisted, turning the laptop around. His hands were actually trembling. Dominic leaned forward, his brow furrowing. He read the decrypted text logs, his eyes scanning the glowing white text against the black terminal screen. "Madeline, Salvatore moves tonight at 3 a.m., Brooklyn Navy Yard, Pier 14. He has 12 men armed with automatic rifles. They are going to ambush Dominic's shipment and kill him, Lorenzo. Why give this to me, little bird? Let him die." "Madeline, if Dominic dies, Salvatore takes the throne. You know he won't honor the Brooklyn boundaries. He'll come for your family next. Stop the hit at Pier 14, and I will ensure you get the northern distribution routes undisturbed. Just save my husband." Lorenzo, a wife who bargains with the devil to save the demon who doesn't appreciate her. Fine, keep your phone on. When the shooting starts, you will need extraction. The air was sucked out of the room. Dominic stared at the screen, the words burning themselves into his retinas. Just save my husband. She hadn't betrayed him. She had sold out a fraction of his empire to save his pathetic life. And while she was negotiating with a rival boss to keep Dominic breathing, he was accusing her of infidelity and locking her out in a freezing storm. A profound, paralyzing dread seized Dominic's chest. He had thrown an unarmed, freezing woman onto the streets, while a heavily armed hit squad, loyal to his traitorous uncle, was prowling the city. Dominic violently pushed his chair back. It crashed against the hardwood floor. "Matteo!" he roared, a sound so primal and full of panic that the underboss was in the room before the echo died. "Boss? Salvatore is the leak. He's moving on Pier 14 at 3 o'clock. We need to go, now. And Matteo—" Dominic's voice cracked, a rare, horrifying display of vulnerability for the Mafia king. "Find my wife. Get every man on the street. Tear Manhattan apart if you have to." "Dominic, the police scanner," Matteo interrupted, his face draining of color. He held up a radio transponder. "A 1013 just went out. Heavy gunfire reported near the Dumbo waterfront, right on the edge of Castiglione territory. A witness reported a silver Aston Martin getting pinned by 2 unmarked tactical vans." Lorenzo's car. Dominic didn't speak. He grabbed his custom 1911 pistol from the table, shoved it into his shoulder holster, and sprinted for the elevator. The drive to Brooklyn was a blur of roaring engines and hydroplaning tires. Dominic drove his armored Mercedes SUV like a man possessed, blowing through red lights, the wipers aggressively fighting the relentless downpour. His mind was a chaotic loop of Madeline's face, her tear-streaked cheeks, her desperate plea. "You have to trust me." They arrived at the waterfront just south of the Manhattan Bridge. The smell of copper, gasoline, and cordite hung heavy in the damp air. The scene was a war zone. 2 unmarked black vans were completely wrecked, smoke billowing from their shattered hoods. Several bodies wearing tactical gear, Salvatore's men, lay motionless on the wet asphalt. But Dominic didn't care about them. His eyes were locked on the silver Aston Martin. It was crushed against a concrete bridge pillar, the driver's side door completely torn off its hinges. The luxury vehicle was riddled with high-caliber bullet holes, the windows entirely blown out. Dominic threw his Mercedes into park before it had even fully stopped, leaping out into the freezing rain. "Madeline!" he screamed, his voice tearing at his throat. He ran toward the wreckage, his gun raised, scanning for threats. But the street was eerily quiet, save for the hiss of the rain against the hot engine block of the Aston Martin. He rounded the back of the destroyed car, and his heart stopped. Lying on the jagged, broken glass of the wet pavement was Madeline. She was unconscious, her pale skin glowing like porcelain in the harsh glare of the distant streetlights. Draped heavily over her trembling body was a thick, bespoke cashmere overcoat, a coat Dominic immediately recognized. It belonged to Lorenzo Castiglione. The rival boss had covered her to keep her warm before disappearing into the night, likely wounded himself after single-handedly taking on Salvatore's men. But the coat wasn't enough to hide the blood. A dark, terrifying crimson pool was expanding rapidly from beneath Madeline's right shoulder, mixing with the puddles of rain on the asphalt. She had been caught in the crossfire. "No, no, no," Dominic choked out, dropping to his knees so hard the impact bruised bone. He threw his gun aside and pulled her into his chest. Her skin was like ice. "Maddie, baby, look at me. Open your eyes." Her eyelashes fluttered, barely parting. Her breath was a weak, rattling wheeze. "Dom? Inic? I'm here. I'm right here," he sobbed, pressing his large, trembling hand violently against the gunshot wound on her shoulder to stem the bleeding. The hot blood soaked through his fingers instantly. The ruthless, cold Mafia king, who ruled with an iron fist, was completely shattered, rocking his dying wife in the middle of a Brooklyn street. "Did you stop him?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the rain. She wasn't asking about her own survival. She was asking if he was safe from his uncle. I did. You saved me," Dominic wept, pressing his forehead against hers. He looked up at Matteo, who was sprinting toward them with a medical kit. "Call Elias Russo. Tell him to prep the underground theater right now. If she dies, Matteo, if she dies because of my pride, I will burn this entire city to the ground." Madeline's eyes rolled back, her body going completely limp in his arms. The rain continued to fall, washing the blood into the storm drains, as Dominic Vitiello realized that the only man who had treated his wife with dignity tonight was his worst enemy. The frantic race to the underground surgical suite on 11th Avenue was a blur of flashing streetlights and deafening silence. The Mercedes SUV tore through the desolate streets of Manhattan, completely ignoring the red lights reflecting in the freezing rain. In the back seat, Dominic held Madeline against his chest, pressing a blood-soaked towel to her shoulder. He could feel her pulse fading, a weak, erratic flutter against his palm. For a man who had built an empire on calculated ruthlessness, the sheer terror gripping his throat was entirely foreign. He was entirely helpless, relying on the speed of his driver and the fragile thread of his wife's heartbeat. The syndicate's private medical facility was hidden beneath an abandoned textile warehouse. It was a state-of-the-art trauma center, heavily guarded and completely off the grid. Dr. Thomas Abernathy, a disgraced former chief of surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital, who now operated exclusively for New York's criminal elite, was waiting at the loading dock. The moment the SUV screeched to a halt, a team of medics descended. Dominic refused to let go. He carried Madeline through the harsh, fluorescent-lit corridors himself, his custom Tom Ford suit ruined, completely saturated with her blood. He laid her gently on the stainless steel operating table. Dr. Abernathy stepped in immediately, barking orders to his nurses. "You need to leave, Dominic," Abernathy ordered, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. "The bullet shattered her clavicle and nicked the subclavian artery. She's bleeding out internally. If you stay in here, you're going to watch her die." For a second, Dominic looked like he was going to execute the surgeon. His jaw clenched, his dark eyes hollow and wild. But Matteo, who had followed them in, placed a firm hand on his boss's shoulder. "Boss, let him work. We have a war to fight tonight." Dominic was pulled out of the operating room, the heavy metal doors slamming shut behind him. The sudden isolation was suffocating. He collapsed into a plastic chair in the sterile hallway, burying his face in his trembling, blood-stained hands. The rhythmic, agonizingly slow beep of the heart monitor bled through the walls. Every agonizing second that passed felt like a physical blow. He replayed the evening in his mind, the accusations, the cruelty, the sight of her shivering in the freezing sleet. He had handed her a death sentence out of sheer, unadulterated hubris. "Matteo," Dominic's voice was a ragged whisper. He didn't look up. "I'm here, Dominic." "Where is my uncle?" The underboss crossed his arms, his expression hardening into cold stone. Salvatore's hit squad was completely decimated by Lorenzo Castiglione. But Salvatore wasn't at the docks. We pinged his burner phone. He's hiding out at the old safe house in Staten Island. He knows the ambush failed. He's packing up to flee to Montreal. Dominic finally looked up. The devastation in his eyes had been entirely replaced by a terrifying, abyssal emptiness. The Mafia King was back, but the coldness that usually defined him was now fueled by a catastrophic rage. He slowly stood up, unbuttoning his ruined suit jacket and tossing it onto the floor. He drew his custom 1911 pistol, checking the magazine with a sharp, mechanical precision. "Lock down this hospital," Dominic commanded. "Nobody goes in. Nobody comes out. If Lorenzo Castiglione sends men to check on her, stand down. Treat them with respect. But if anyone else steps foot on this block, kill them." "And Salvatore?" Matteo asked. "Salvatore is mine." The drive to Staten Island took less than 40 minutes. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a thick, icy fog that rolled off the harbor. The safe house was a dilapidated Victorian mansion sitting on a secluded wooded lot. There were no guards outside. Salvatore was trying to keep a low profile. It was the last mistake the old man would ever make. Dominic kicked the heavy oak door completely off its hinges. The crash echoed through the empty foyer. Salvatore, a heavy-set man in his late 60s with silver hair and panicked eyes, froze at the top of the sweeping staircase. He was clutching a leather duffel bag. "Dominic!" Salvatore stammered, taking a step backward. "Dominic, listen to me. The Castigliones set me up. They manipulated the intercepts." Dominic didn't say a word. He walked slowly up the stairs, his footsteps echoing like a ticking clock in the massive house. The silence was far more terrifying than any threat. "You're my blood!" Salvatore screamed, dropping the bag and raising a small revolver. His hands were shaking violently. "I raised you after your father died. I built this family. It belongs to me." Dominic stopped on the step just below his uncle. He looked at the old man, feeling absolutely nothing. "You built nothing," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a chilling, dead whisper. "You tried to steal my throne, and in doing so you almost killed my wife. She saved my life. And you? You are a disease." Before Salvatore could pull the trigger, Dominic raised his weapon and fired twice. The deafening cracks shattered the heavy silence of the house. Salvatore collapsed backward, tumbling down the carpeted stairs until he landed in a lifeless heap at the bottom. Dominic didn't even watch him fall. He turned around, his face a mask of absolute apathy, and walked out into the freezing fog. The leak was plugged. The betrayal was avenged. But the real consequence of his pride was still fighting for her life in a cold hospital room. It took 4 agonizing days for Madeline to wake up. 4 days of Dominic sitting in the plastic chair beside her bed, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep, leaving the daily operations of the syndicate entirely to Matteo. The criminal underworld of New York was buzzing with rumors of Salvatore's brutal execution. But Dominic couldn't care less. He watched the steady rise and fall of Madeline's chest, haunted by the memory of locking her out in the sleet. On the 5th morning, the harsh fluorescent lights of the underground clinic had been dimmed. Dominic was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He heard a soft, dry rustle of sheets. "Dominic?" His head snapped up. Madeline's green eyes were half open, heavily glazed from the morphine, but she was looking right at him. She looked impossibly fragile, an oxygen tube resting beneath her nose, her right shoulder heavily bandaged. Dominic exhaled a shaky breath, falling to his knees beside the bed. He reached out to grab her hand, but hesitated, his fingers hovering inches from her skin. He didn't feel worthy to touch her. "I'm here, Maddie. I'm right here. You're safe." Madeline stared at him for a long, silent moment. The warmth that used to reside in her eyes was completely gone, replaced by a guarded, defensive wall. She slowly pulled her hand away, tucking it under the thin hospital blanket. The gesture hit Dominic harder than any bullet ever could. "I didn't betray you," she whispered, her voice incredibly weak and raspy. "I know," Dominic choked out, his chest tightening painfully. The ruthless boss of the Vitiello family lowered his head, tears stinging the corners of his eyes. "I know everything. Elias decrypted the burner phone. You traded the northern routes to Lorenzo to save my life. You sacrificed yourself for a man who didn't even have the decency to trust you. Madeline, I am so sorry. I was blind. I was arrogant." She turned her head away, staring at the blank concrete wall. "You locked me out in the freezing rain, Dominic. You didn't even give me a coat. If Lorenzo hadn't been watching the apartment, I would have died on that street before the bullets ever found me. You didn't protect me. The enemy did." Her words were quiet, but they sliced through him with absolute precision. She was right. He had failed his most sacred duty. "I will spend the rest of my life making this right," Dominic promised, his voice trembling with fierce sincerity. "I killed Salvatore. The internal threat is gone. You are the only thing that matters now." Madeline finally looked back at him. "What about Lorenzo? I promised him the northern routes. If you go back on that deal, he will go to war." Dominic stood up slowly, wiping his face and adjusting his cuffs. "I am handling Lorenzo today. Rest, Maddie. When you wake up, things will be different, I swear it." 3 hours later, the private dining room of Le Bernardin in Midtown Manhattan was cleared of all civilian patrons. Dominic sat at the long mahogany table, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The doors opened, and Lorenzo Castiglione walked in. The rival boss had his left arm in a sling, a souvenir from the shootout at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but he carried himself with an undeniable, lethal grace. Lorenzo sat across from Dominic, a faint, mocking smile playing on his lips. "I must admit, Vitiello, I expected a war today. Instead, you invite me to a Michelin star restaurant. Has the great king finally gone soft?" "My wife is awake," Dominic said, cutting straight to the point. His tone was respectful, devoid of its usual venom. "Dr. Abernathy says she will make a full recovery." Lorenzo's smile faded into a serious, assessing stare. "She is a brave woman, braver than you deserve. She stood in front of a firing squad to keep you breathing." "I know," Dominic replied softly. He reached into his tailored jacket and slid a thick leather folder across the polished mahogany table. "The deeds and operational schedules for the northern distribution routes, just like she promised you. I am honoring her deal." Lorenzo opened the folder, his eyebrows raising in genuine surprise. "You're giving up 30% of your territory, just like that. You saved my wife's life, Lorenzo. You put your own coat on her back when I threw her to the wolves," Dominic said, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto his rivals. "The routes are yours. Consider the blood feud between our families settled. If you ever need a favor, the Vitiello Syndicate will answer. That is not a business negotiation. That is a debt of honor." Lorenzo closed the folder slowly, studying Dominic. For the first time in a decade, there was no hatred between the two men, only a mutual, silent understanding of the fragile nature of their violent world. "Take care of her, Dominic. If you break her heart again, I won't hesitate to take the rest of your city." Dominic nodded once, standing up from the table. "She won't need your protection ever again." A month later, the Tribeca penthouse was silent, but it was no longer a tomb. The storm outside had passed, replaced by the crisp, clear sunlight of a December morning. Madeline stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a thick cashmere shawl wrapped around her healing shoulder. She watched the city below, a city that now answered to both of them. Dominic walked into the room, stopping a few feet away. He didn't demand her attention. He waited for her to acknowledge him. She turned, offering a small, cautious smile. The wall between them hadn't completely crumbled, but the foundation was rebuilding. He stepped forward, gently wrapping his arms around her waist, mindful of her injury. He rested his chin on her uninjured shoulder, looking out at the empire she had saved. He was still a cold mafia king to the world, but in this room, he was simply a man entirely devoted to his queen. If you were captivated by this intense story of betrayal, sacrifice, and mafia redemption, hit that like button. We release thrilling romance dramas just like this every week, full of plot twists and heart-stopping moments. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new upload. Drop a comment below. Did Dominic deserve a second chance, or should Madeline have left with Lorenzo? Let us know, and stay tuned for the next dark romance.